and basically you have to care. So the question is, are you going to address these issues with science or not? We all as children, we love animals. You know, it's something very ingrained and it's very internal. I think though that India has a unique opportunity to come up with solutions which will involve the good of people and like any kind of sample, poop is the most plentiful, so you will be very happy with it.
Welcome to SciTalk. Joining us today is the wildlife conservation ecologist, Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan from NCBS Bangalore. So ma'am, from your 15-year career so far, could you just give us a sense of all your biggest hits of your career?
I guess it's just been a really long journey of exploration, and I would kind of classify it into 3 periods of 5 years each. And so I guess the first phase of 5 years was really about exploring. I hadn't worked in India before. I did my PhD and postdoc in the US to really understand like a child in a candy store, so much of biodiversity to study, what kinds of things might be interesting to start investigating. And we did a bunch of things. We looked at a new species of macaque called the Munzala. We worked on using genetics to estimate the numbers of tigers in a park and whether they've been through population declines based on whatever tools we had at the time. The key hallmark of that time was really standardizing some new methods, genetic methods, to work with non-invasive samples, which is fecal samples and so on. So second phase, we did a lot of biogeography, which is looking at which species are where and why in the Indian subcontinent. And we worked a lot on birds and mammals. That period was kind of dominated by investigations in mountains. So a very talented postdoc, Robin, we looked together with him at the Western Ghats and how the shape of the mountain is driving speciation and in a sense creating biodiversity. And I guess the final, the third, like the last 5 years has been a lot about grappling with new technologies. There's been a huge change in genetic sequencing and really focus on endangered species. So I'm back to endangered species from taking that sojourn into biogeography. And we've been working on species like tigers and more on isolated populations. So it's been really fun to basically, I've been lucky, I think, to be able to continue working on tigers as a system for several years now.
So what's your process when you have decided to work on a particular organism? What is your process from asking the first question to the data that you will make available that can then go on to possibly become a policy?
I think that the step is always to define the question, what might be a relevant question, what kind of data are needed to answer that question, and then like basically I'll give you an example. We're working, we started some work on vultures, gyps vultures, which are critically endangered. They went through a 99.9% decline because of this drug called diclofenac. So they're scavengers and they eat carcasses. And basically a lot of veterinarians use this drug like crocin for cows. And it's also there in, our painkillers, you'll see if you look at one. And diclofenac has this effect that it immediately kills vultures. When they eat a carcass which has diclofenac, they die on the spot pretty much. So the question we wanted to ask is, then once this crash happened, diclofenac was banned, right? There has been very slow vulture recovery, right, in few places. And the question we wanted to ask is, are vultures eating cows now because people have stopped using diclofenac, or are they actually subsisting on wild prey, which never really would get medicated and so would not have diclofenac? Now this has implications because it tells you then, if they're eating exclusively wild prey, then it tells you that the ban has not worked and people are still using diclofenac despite the ban. Now the action, that's the science. The action would be, what else should they use? Why has it not worked? So on and so forth. So we don't usually get involved in that action. we would have some partners or something like that. Usually NGOs which would go in that direction. But this one would be, okay, how do we figure out what the vultures are eating? What kind of methods do we develop? How do we sample? Where do we go? How do we get enough data to give a comprehensive picture of this question? So those kinds of things.
I hope this is a hypothetical situation, but if someone joins your group and they have an impressive resume and very enthusiastic about working with you, but their only holdup is they can't work with poop.
Okay.
So what do you tell them?
Well, I mean, I guess they can't do it at all, or they can't even get over it. I would say
it's a holdup, but-
let's try to get over it, and I would try to convince them about what a treasure trove of information it is. Plus, if you actually go to the field and you ask those questions in the field, you're like, oh my God, any kind of sample, poop is the most plentiful, so you will be very happy with it.
I mean, so a feces sample can be used to trace it back to the individual. That
Yes, yes.
maybe that's something to be said about people who leave their samples.
Yeah. In fact, it's really funny you bring that up, because there's apparently a company now in New York City.
Okay.
So when you kind of move into an apartment, you have to pay an additional pet deposit, and then you have to give a sample of your pet, either a saliva sample or something. They have this company which is continuously surveying the IDs of the dogs where they find dog poop. And so if it's your dog, you get a fine. So there are such applications out there, though of course in India we don't have such regulations about dogs pooping, but or anyone for that matter. Yeah.
But is our technology there? We could do something like this.
Yeah, easily. Yeah.
Okay.
So we are trying to work on something like this in the context of conflict. So in human-wildlife conflict, we just got a project with National Geographic where we're going to actually look at. So basically, when tigers kill, they bite in the jugular. Sometimes, not always, we're able to get genetic material from the predator. And so if we had a database of predators, like, when you sign into the apartment, you give your sample of your dog. If we had that, we could then match and see, which individuals are conflicting. There the question is, where is there more conflict? Are there pinch points? Are there certain places where there's more conflict? Are there certain individuals who are doing more conflict? What is the story? What's happening, right? So those are the kinds of scientific answers we need to think of. Otherwise, there's conflict, you catch an individual and you move on. So a lot of times managers respond to crisis situations. We are trying to see whether we can step back, understand the whole picture, and give a prediction for what might be a good way to approach the question.
Right. So on the note of human-wildlife conflict, so if someone were to ask you the question that it is important, sure, but just how important is it addressing human-wildlife conflict and not just letting the status quo be?
How can you not address it? I mean, you have to, right? So the question is, are you going to address these issues with science or not? You can address them in any way. You can catch an animal, move it, do this, do that. So my goal, very modest, has just been to try to produce data which someone can use to actually make that decision.
One problem I think that you would have in your career is that you have to find the balance between conservation and human activity.
So I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't really comment on how this balance can be achieved. But I know there is no future without a balance.
Right. But then if not a balance, a boundary maybe then?
So the thing is that, our parks are too small. So basically, all of India's protected areas are only 3 times of Kruger National Park. And in small areas, large animals, how many can you have? So then they're going to be moving around, right? But I think though that India has a unique opportunity to come up with solutions which will involve the good of people and wildlife.
As part of your work, you would be required to collaborate with experts from various domains. Like a lot of people coming together to then affect policy and practice. So what different domains are these?
So, I have to say that contributing to policy is a very big thing. I have not done that so much. The NH7 case is probably the closest to not policy, but action, conservation action. But we do have several stakeholders in this process. There are the managers who tend to be from the forest department. We work a lot of times with assistants who are local people, and that's really a wonderful thing that we get to do. And there's of course other stakeholders like ecologists or engineers and so on and so forth. So when you're talking about, say, solutions to conflict, you have to talk to the villagers, you have to talk to the district administration, you have to talk to so many different people, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. It's very hard. Like it's easy for us to say, okay, I don't agree with that person, I'm not going to talk to them. But to say, okay, let's not agree, but let's try to sit together is very hard. But the future is only about that, because there will be very varied opinions, but we have to work together, because all the problems we face, nothing can be solved by individual efforts. They all require multiple stakeholders to come together for a common cause. So yeah, so basically in summary, I think it's really important for scientists to interact outside of their domains, because first of all, you get too cocooned up and in the ivory tower, but it's really good to be able to talk to others and so on.
I think I read one case about you actually helping out forensics when it came to poaching.
Yeah. So that was a paper we did a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, on leopards, where it was really funny. So there's this police, he's a IG wildlife cell in the police department. And for some reason, he calls me Doc. So I always feel like Bugs Bunny, because he calls up and says, "What's up, Doc?" So I feel like, oh, I better be chewing a carrot right now. But anyway, he's a really, really nice gentleman called Mr. Chikkarur. And he said, you have to come to my office now. And so, I rushed over, and there he had 26 leopard skins laid out on the floor. And he said, you need to tell me where these leopards are from. If there's more poaching happening in one place versus the other, we need to think of how to control it, right? So obviously this set of skins was being consolidated in Bangalore. They'd come from multiple places or whatever. So this is actually not called forensics, it's called intelligence more. So forensics would be to just identify which is the species which is being poached, right? So I said, that sounds good, but again, we need to have a database of leopards from across the country where we know this animal is from here, that animal is from here, and then we put together all of their genetics to get a landscape of how genes change over space. Then we can say, okay, this unknown individual, looks like it's from here, right? So it actually took us several years to collect initially some leopard samples from across India, build that database, and then do these assignment tests for these 26 leopards. So these kind of studies are generally lacking. It would be really important for us to try to do these kinds of studies to understand where poaching may be happening, in case we don't know about it.
This kind of makes me wish there was a TV show a wildlife investigator.
Yeah.
Where you're just
basically
called.
Yeah, we're just like detectives. We're just trying to figure out who is this animal, why is he or she here, who are they mating with. So it's all about actually sleuthing around on their lives, which we can't do by watching them.
A common concern for people who are returning back to India is the research facilities. But in some ways, the advantage that you have is that with the
then my facilities are here. I can never do this kind of work in the US.
After you completed your postdoc at Stanford, you then returned to India to start your independent research career. So was this a conscious choice to return?
I never wanted to stay in the US. I was just waiting to come back. It's it sounds very corny, but it's kind of my destiny. I have to be here.
And then being the first sort of eco-Evo person in NCBS, how did that come about?
I just happened to land up in NCBS. I'd probably never get a job there if I was to apply today. And in a way, it was nice to be at NCBS because no one really understood much of what I was doing. So they completely left me alone to be myself and do whatever I wanted. I always tried to get more people from this area generally, because I strongly believe that when you talk about a National Center for Biological Sciences, it cannot simply be only, cell molecular biophys, neuro or whatever, right? There has to be organismal biology, and there has to be, you have to come out of the lab as well.
Around the time you were setting up your lab,
yeah,
you were also setting up your family. I mean, you were expecting your first
I had
child.
my first
and
daughter,
I mean, setting up a lab is difficult.
Yeah.
And expecting a child and preparing for that is difficult. How did you get through that period?
I don't really remember actually. It was a lot of changes, because it was moving back, starting a job and having a baby, and so that was a lot of things. But I guess I just took it one day at a time, and I have a very supportive husband, and I think I never thought of anything else as an option. I just kept going, that's all. I never thought, oh, this is so difficult or whatever. That's what I had to do. So,
Then again, it's one thing to do that when you're a lab researcher and you have to go to one set building, one set lab again and again. But then you're taking care of children and you have to go in the wild.
Yeah.
So how was balancing that?
I was okay. I mean, I think I took my kids to the field many times. I think I always just folded them into my life, whatever was needed at the time. It's easier when they're young, actually. Once they're in school, it becomes a little harder. Only thing is, actually, I miss them a lot when I'm not with them.
Looking back, if you had to
Change
use
something.
that time to, your experiences, to give advice to young women scientists who might be in the same position, what would you tell them?
I mean, I guess I would say to be kind to yourself and to not really always judge yourself as only a mother or only a scientist, because you are both, and you may doubt yourself, but you do bring a lot to your department, to your university or your institute. So don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt yourself.
And I mean, you did mention the fact of changing any
Yeah.
part of this. Would you have?
I have to say that for me, the best part of it all has really been the journey with the students and the postdocs. And I wouldn't change that at all. So then I wouldn't change anything because then everything else would change.
On the other side, what do you think institutes could do to support women going through something like this?
I mean, I think that, it's really important to give people time and sometimes and flexibility. Having very tight schedules and kind of requirements to be here at this time or that time and so on make it very difficult. And sometimes you have to trust people. I think it's really important to trust people. And the thing is, sometimes you feel like if you don't show up, then it looks like you're not bothered, that kind of thing. So that's the other thing with which I don't have, but I think it would be very important as a woman scientist to have, is to really have confidence in yourself and to be able to draw boundaries and say, you know what, I really can't do this, and it doesn't matter in the long term.
Incidents from your fieldwork that have stayed with you?
A lot of it is sometimes hard work, but then it's a very private experience too. It's not something you can talk about it, you can write about it, but you can never really convey the beauty of that moment. It's almost like a spiritual feeling. I'm not a very spiritual person, so for me this is as close as it gets to a very spiritual feeling.
So on a practical note, do you think there is an adequate infrastructure in India considering the risks of fieldwork?
It would be great to have a much larger community of scientists working in the field. The systems, the way they are, would not necessarily, they won't discourage it actively, but science is becoming much more professionalized now. You have to publish, you have to get grants, you have to keep producing, and so that, some things which are very hard or you don't know what the outcome will be, you tend to be moving towards something which is not easier to predict, but at least something will come out of it, right? And a lot of our work, our time also goes in the beginning into logistics, which is not a science thing. It's just about, okay, this person contact that person, this person. So I think, this is my opinion and I might be wrong, others may disagree, but I think the current system in India with small and short grants, professionalization of science, will not necessarily encourage field-related research because it tends to be risky, tends to be long-term, tends to be expensive, and so on. So then, as a result, less and less people will choose to work on field research, which would be a loss for the country. I think there's so much very interesting science we can do by studying natural systems. And also, I think there needs to be a greater encouragement of collaborations so that there's not a critical mass, but if different different PIs and professors are working together, that will be really good. There's some new initiatives. There's just recently announced the long-term ecological observatory program, which is focusing on several sites across India, and there's teams of people looking at birds and things like that. So those kinds of initiatives are really good, but there should be a lot more of them.
And so, sometime back on Twitter,
Yeah.
a couple of years back, you had said that a PhD or even, a specialization is not essential to get into conservation.
Yeah, I believe that.
So, could you expand on that?
PhD is a great training. It forces you to be independent, trains your mind, asks you to question, asks you to critique, and so on and so forth. but it may not be essential for a career in conservation. Yeah, so basically the thing is, conservation is a very broad thing, right? You could work with communities, you could work on action, you could work on outreach, you could work on communication, you could work on policy, you could work on the interface with government. There's so many things. You could do the science. So a lot of people who come into conservation are drawn by a landscape or a species. And depending on how they feel they can contribute to that cause, they have to do whatever educational, whatever requirement it takes. A lot of times, learning management, learning communication, getting people together to talk about the same thing or think in the same way, interaction. These things are very, very valuable skills which you don't necessarily get in your PhD.
So you have just emphasized the importance of communication, and you have also spoken about how you have to take your communication with these stakeholders, of course, and then also to the non-specialist general audience.
Yeah. I do a lot of that kind of communication. Yeah.
What have you learned lessons from your experiences that you're taking into talking to the general audience?
I think that practice is the most important thing, and then the desire to actually communicate and not just talk. And I think also sometimes people are shy, so it's not just they don't want to communicate. They feel like they don't know enough, or maybe they've not done enough work or something like that. But I guess I feel it doesn't matter. You have to basically talk to people, because you can't go and live in a cave and come back after 4 years and talk to people. That doesn't work. You have to continuously communicate.
And what do you think is the minimum information? I mean, of course, a non-specialist cannot know everything.
I think there's nothing like that. I think it's basically minimum information. I think it's something which is so basic to us as humans, environment and biodiversity, and we all as children, we love animals. It's something very ingrained and it's very internal. So I think that you just have to appeal to a person's sense of feeling. So science is supposed to be very objective and theoretical. But I'm not that kind of a scientist. I'm driven by emotion and passion. And so that's the way I would approach a person I'm communicating with as well. The other thing is I have to remind myself too, I think scientists can sometimes be almost like they're so used to teaching. They're like teaching to everyone, and that becomes almost like preaching. So you have to be very careful to try and listen to the other person's perspective as well. And basically you have to care. You have to care not about how you're looking, but how you're communicating. Are you communicating to them or not? So not how your science is looking great or not, or what you've done is looking great or not, but are they able to understand, and are you guys connecting? I think that's the most important thing.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks.